evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and welcome to this April 7th edition of Beyond the Headlines. My name is Colin Dowe, and I'll be serving as your host this evening. Thank you so very much, as always, for sharing part of your Monday evening with us. So whether you're tuning to GBN Television, listening to us via GBN Radio, or any of our social media platforms, at home, in your car, the bus, wherever you are, thank you for joining us and welcome to Beyond the Headlines. This evening we take a look at the imposition of tariffs by the United States of America on countries worldwide and interrogate what impact that can have on Caribbean economies. With me this evening I have the President of the Grenada Chamber of Industry and Commerce, Mr. Colin Francis. He is joined in studio by Research Assistant Kunta Kinte Andal. And online, we have the CEO of the CARICOM private sector organization, Dr. Patrick Antoine. Gentlemen, welcome to Beyond the Headlines.
Nice to meet you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
And it is important, and let me start. I'll deliberately start with you, Dr. Antoine, because before we got started on the show, I did a backhand comment in saying thanks to President Trump that we are aware that there is an organ of CARICOM that is the CARICOM private sector organization. And this I heard about a few weeks ago when you began your advocacy when the tariffs were being contemplated. So share a little bit about the CARICOM private sector organization so our audience and viewers are aware of your mandate.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. And it's really your feeling that you haven't heard of the CPSO before, and I smile. The CPSO was established in the first quarter of 2020, just before COVID struck. And we were established as an institution to bring the full capacity of the CARICOM private sector into the member states fully achieving the CSME. What that means is really fully implementing the CSME in all its dimensions. So we cover all the areas that are covered by the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. And we are represented across the member states of the community, 5,500 entities plus are members of the CPSO in various configurations. You would have heard of our work because we actually are the ones who developed 4 heads, the 25 by 2025 that you would have heard about throughout the community, which is to reduce CARICOM's food imports by 25% by 2025, which is now by 2030. And we are also very involved in the work on the establishment of a CARICOM or regional stock exchange. And of course, we are deep in the sort of throes of the trade issues, both in relation to the US, but also in relation to other blocks and groupings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you are correct. So your work I'm familiar with is just the entity I was not. So you'd let your work speak for you, and that is how I saw your mom told you that should be the case, right? Colin, the chamber, and the work of the chamber, the mandate of the chamber as an umbrella body.
Thanks, and Colin, again, good evening, and happy to be here, and good evening to your viewers as well. So the work of the chamber is the largest representation of the private sector in Grenada. And the work of the chamber goes everywhere from advocacy, but ensuring that the private sector continues to have a strong voice, a strong, productive voice to help build our economies and ensure that Grenadians have a community where we can all thrive. And so we do a lot of advocacy, we do a lot of lobbying on the back end when legislation is being drafted. The chamber is very intimately involved in seeking feedback from our membership and putting those proposals to the government and ensuring there is constructive dialogue to ensure that whatever is passed in Parliament is the best for not only the Grenada private sector, but also for the people of Grenada. And so we do quite a bit of work. And in recent times, we've actually been looking at areas where we can build capacity locally for Grenadians to help support private sector initiatives and training as well, and training from complex trainings to very basic training we've gotten involved in, just to ensure that persons who are employed in the private sector have the skill set required to push businesses forward and to help create that growth that we're looking for.
Okay, thank you. Kinta Kunte, have you introduced yourself to the audience deliberately, just so that people understand? It's not that we were looking for a young face to join the two experienced gentlemen,
yes,
but you do bring a certain unique perspective to the conversation.
Yeah, that's correct, and I'm grateful to be here with these men of expertise, right? My name is Kunta Kinte Andal. I'm a graduate of the St. George's University in International Business, but I'm also a research assistant, and my research areas are government performance, international commercial investment, and to a certain extent the interplay and the interdisciplinary activity between geopolitical events and the moderating effects on the global south, or what we call the global south. So that would include countries or regions like CARICOM, ASEAN, some of the ACS, ACP islands, and developing Africa. So that's my research interest, and I'm really interested in not just the philosophical underpinnings, but the practical implications for these geopolitical events.
Right, and the practical implications is really what we are interested about, exactly, because that's what the population needs to hear about. So, Patrick, please, the tariff impact on countries. We came to a point where there is a blanket 10% placed on countries by the U.S. Some others got special attention, but there was a blanket 10%. As you reflect on CARICOM, will this impact countries in the same way? And if there are differences, can you share some of those nuances?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So, yes, outside of Guyana, where if you take the petroleum products out, they would be at 10%. And in fact, I think those discussions are ongoing now because they were the outlier in CARICOM at 38%. There is, in fact, going to be a differential impact across the countries. So if you were to think of the countries that were perhaps most dependent on the U.S. markets, those would be the ones that would be impacted perhaps greatest, and then we need to break that down a little bit. So let's go from the export side. So in terms of exports, in terms of percentages, one of the countries, or the country that is most dependent on the U.S. market for exports is actually Jamaica. No oil and gas, but dependent on the U.S. One of the groupings that's least dependent on the U.S. in terms of exports is in fact the OECS countries. So that you have that there, and let me add Suriname in there as well, and Guyana, right? So those three countries, those three groupings, as I've just mentioned, OECS, the OECS 6, Guyana and Suriname, least dependent on exports to the United States. When you look at it in total, and I know people are thinking about oil and gas, we're talking about percentages. So they're the ones that would essentially be hit the least. And of course, with Guyana, if you take the petroleum products out, you're going to see that the impact is not great.
Just to be clear, we're taking the petroleum products out in the case of Guyana because those are exempted.
Those are exempted. They're in what is called Annex 2, and Annex 2 is an annex which has a list of items that are exempted from the tariffs. And it's interesting because that list is not constructed by chance. That list is actually based on the U.S.'s interest. The U.S. imports raw petroleum products and exports refined petroleum products. It imports alumina and it exports aluminum. So all of those products that the U.S. has an exemption on. And there's one food product, only one. It's called coral, and they use it in medications, etc. That's exempt as well. So that list is constructed again based on the U.S.'s interest. So in terms of the exports, Grenada is one of the countries in the OECS that is least dependent on the U.S. market for two reasons. Our export levels are not large, but our exports to the U.S. are about 12.6%. So on the tariff side, just based on that measure going into the U.S., Grenada's exports are not going to be heavily hit, but that's not the whole story. There is another dimension to this story that I think people often forget, and we're introducing this in a meeting with CARICOM on Wednesday. The other side of this story is that there are about 30% of the imports into the region that do not originate in the United States.
Right.
They pass through the United States, and we call that the fulfillment imports. They're imports from third countries that are sort of either accumulated in the U.S. Because of perhaps logistic and supply chains, because of relationships, because of finance. And they're exported from the U.S. to countries such as ours. And that 30% comes from a range of countries, including China. So when the tariffs are high on the 30% I've mentioned, let us say that there's 20 of that 30% that come from high tariff countries. There's going to be a pass-through effect. And that's where it's going to catch us in terms of our imports from the United States. So you'll say, yes, on the import side, really, there's no impediment. But the truth is that when you look at the nature of these exports coming out of the United States and where they originate, that's where we're going to get caught. So we need to look at the import side as well. And on the import side, I'm telling this story, the OECS countries are most dependent. And that's news for you on your program tonight. Secondly, it's Trinidad and Tobago. Thirdly, it's Belize. And the countries that are least dependent on the import side, so from the pass-through or third country effects, that's where you're going to see some impacts on those countries. So I've just given you that. So you have a flavor. And in the case of Grenada, the level of our imports from the United States is about 36%. Not all of that 36% originates from the United States. Some passes through. So we're going to have the impact of that in terms of higher prices from tariffs on third countries. Thank you so much.
Right. So essentially the understanding here is that the cost of our inputs are likely to increase because of this transit effect, and hence when we re-export, as it was, as a finished product, then we are hit with the tariffs in addition to that. So then the cost of doing business with Grenada has just gone up. Kinta Kunde, the tariff adjustment was proposed as a retaliatory action to balance of trade, but yet we saw the cross the board. What do you believe is the cause of this? Because, was it a matter of time? Was it a matter of political semantics? What would you propose was the cause of this? Because it was positioned as balance of trade, but it was across the board. So it was not necessarily targeted at countries specifically.
Yeah, so I think, framing this tariff imposition is important. In the U.S. law, there is this idea or this legislative concept which includes Section 232, and it's named the Trade Act of 1974, and then there's the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. When you combine those two, so Section 232 of 1962 and Section 301 of 1974, when you combine those, you have the U.S. president being given the emergency powers, and it's like IEPA, International Economic Emergency Powers Act, and this allows the president to impose retaliatory tariffs with the aim of balancing trades. But the idea is that it must be a threat to national security in the instance of 1962, and in 1974 it must be some unfair trade practices. So I think framing that is important. So that's the rhetoric, that's the political rhetoric. We have a deficit in trade. We have a significant trade deficit.
But from what you're saying, we have a deficit in trade that is a threat to national security, not merely a deficit in trade.
Exactly. And so the framing of that is important because the U.S. is using the rhetoric of exigency. This is urgent, right? This is a threat to national security, our domestic livelihood. And so when you have a phrasing like that, of course you're going to get these across-the-board tariffs. So in the case of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, you're allowed to have across-the-board tariffs, and it was settled at 10%. In the case of China, another 10%, and then another 34%. But the Trade Act of 1974 allows for specific percentages, and that's where it cannot be across the board. That's why some countries like Canada, Mexico, China, the EU have specific, and even Guyana with the 38%, which is very startling. So that's the framing, the geopolitical framing, and this is this is the idea. When there's growing protectionist sentiment in the global north, this is to be expected, right? So it is of no surprise that we're seeing this. What is surprising is that it's so sudden and so soon.
Okay. Which countries would you have anticipated, if we're talking now balance of trade, would have been targeted? China, we know.
Yes.
But outside of China, which countries? If you're to look at the Caribbean from your own studies, which countries would you have anticipated be targeted?
I would have anticipated Jamaica, I would have anticipated Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Venezuela, to a certain extent Suriname. I think the U.S., their foreign policy has largely been a sort of divide and conquer tactic. So they tend to target the largest players in the bloc. And when they can't do that, then they have the divide and conquer strategy. So I am not too concerned about the moderating effects on the smaller islands. What I am concerned about is the moderating effects on CARICOM as a whole and our ability to bargain in the multilateral trading system. So that's really what I was concerned about in terms of CARICOM.
Okay. Colin?
Guys, let me jump in, Colin, and just clarify one thing. I think he's made a very good point, but I just want to perhaps tweak it a little bit. It is not under the national security provisions that the president has actually taken the action. In fact, this is a key point. It is because he declared a national state of emergency, which has allowed him to bypass the Senate and the House and to act unilaterally. So he's acting as if there was. Right. When, in a real sense, all the indications, if he had to go through the process, would not have given him that power. So he's had to do that by essentially enacting or declaring a national emergency. Right. And it becomes pretty complicated to undo that in the USA system, right, once that is in fact declared. And I think just that small insertion. Right. And in terms of what countries would have been impacted if we look at it geopolitically, again, a small clarification. This was based on a premise that the United States had a massive trade deficit with countries. And how do we solve the deficit? We solve the deficit by essentially taxing there and spending on the U.S. administration's own apparatus at home, right? So that becomes sort of the hypothesis. And if we use that hypothesis, then the countries in CARICOM collectively, we have a massive deficit with the United States. And so countries like ours, we have a deficit, Guyana has a short surplus. So in the ordinary cut and thrust of things, we would not have expected at all to have our countries touched by this measure. And we are also covered, my dear brother, by CBERA, the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act, which we've just gone through some revisions on. But I agree with you that there are certain countries like Venezuela. I agree with you, China. We expected that. I agree that there are a number of other countries for geopolitical reasons and economic reasons. India, South Korea, the countries that essentially have large surpluses with the United States and also flex in an economic category that the U.S. is having a difficulty competing against. And then, of course, you're right about the geopolitical factors. I just thought I would insert those two things just to put context to what we expected and why we are where we are today. Okay, excellent.
Colin, help the Grenadian public understand what this tariff imposed by the U.S. will mean first for corporate Grenada, and then we'll follow up with what it means actually for John Public.
Right. So sure. So tariffs being imposed, and Dr. Antoine has made the point that whilst Grenada does not rely, compared to the other CARICOM countries, its exports are fairly low to the U.S. Right, and there is a massive trade deficit. In January alone, Grenada exported about $600,000 US worth of goods, but imported nearly $12 million US worth of goods from the US. So for Grenada and for Grenada's private sector, especially those companies that operate largely in the agricultural sector, they're going to be impacted because it means the cost of their goods moving from Grenada to the US may be at a higher price point than...
And we're speaking, two things I'd want to ask you here. Is this massive trade deficit, US strong point, 600,000 versus 12 million, an indictment on us, one? And two, as we look at it, when we say primarily agriculture, we're actually speaking of our fishing industry in particular. Is that correct?
You're speaking of spices and fishing as well, right? Those are the highest ones that are exported, right? Your nutmeg and cocoa and also fresh fish. Right. So those get impacted, obviously. And you mentioned, is this an indictment on us? I think in certain respects it is. And we see the thrust by the government now to really focus and double down on agriculture, but not just agriculture for Grenadians to participate, but also throughout CARICOM. And that's where we sort of need to start looking to newer markets to ensure that we diversify our trade, and it's really what the private sector needs to do at this point. We've spoken about agriculture during COVID and doubling down on it, and it seemed after COVID we kind of went back to importing a lot of our food, and food security and sustainability is massive for the region. You saw what happened with the cost of eggs in the US recently, and we're not experiencing the same in this region because we have fairly reliable supply of eggs, a lot of it locally. So for private sector, there's obviously a lot of concern because I touched on the export side, right, but also on the import side, and Dr. Antoine made the point, you have a lot of businesses who say are engaged in projects. And right now, I can tell you in a lot of boardrooms, the discussion is what's going to be the overrun on a particular project, because your cost of importation may just increase from everything from construction equipment to cars, because some of the parts used in the equipment, although it may be manufactured in the US, because the parts are now being brought in from countries, China, India, and so forth, you're now exposed to some of the tariffs hitting components of equipment, and overall the cost of equipment increases, right? And I mean, let's not even go down on the tariff proposed on Chinese-made vessels, and I know Dr. Antoine is very familiar with that. So again, even though you're not in the export sector, and agriculture is the one that's going to be the hardest hit, there's still a concern that your cost of doing business is going to increase, your cost of importation.
Because we import our imports.
Correct.
Because we don't make much here. And by virtue of that, once it's passing through the US, that will be the impact.
And then for Joe Public, it's inflation, because goods are landing here, they may land at a higher price point. And so with inflation, the purchasing power of your disposable income now diminishes. And right now, families are having that discussion, do we buy that new car now? And there's so much, and I think what's added to that is so much uncertainty and no predictability. Right? It's very volatile. So families, I'm sure, are having the discussion whether we get that new mortgage now, or whether we get a mortgage now, or whether we extend on our homes, whether we purchase a car, whether we go on that vacation that we've always planned. Just wait it out. And that too has an impact on private sector, because if persons are delaying decisions that they would have obviously made now, it means that you may have sales dropping.
Because the business will come later.
That's correct.
Right. Well, hopefully come later, but it's not coming now.
Hopefully come later. That's right. So there is an impact all over from a consumer perspective, from the private sector perspective, and we need to find ways to pivot and leverage at this point.
All right. Patrick, we saw recently that you joined the Caribbean Tourism Organization in asking for a call to review the tariffs. Whereas Colin spoke to agriculture, he spoke to the projects in Grenada. How will this impact our tourism sector? Because this, of course, is the largest foreign exchange earner for Grenada. And as we look at the OECS and certainly other territories, tourism is big for us all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, I will tell you that in the oral testimony that I gave at the U.S. Trade Representatives process on China-built vessels, our testimony was the only one to raise the impact on tourism and cruise lines. And as I said on another regional program, you could see the heads of the 10 commissioners who were there to receive the testimony snap when we mentioned the impact on tourism and cruise lines, for the reason that we live in the most tourist-dependent economies in the world. Let me say, among the most tourist-dependent economies in the world, 10 of our countries have ratios that are up there. How will it impact us? One, our hoteliers that have established plants will see the cost of providing services go up. So goods and services, the cost will certainly increase. That's the first impact. It will increase because others are now competing for the same goods because there is this rush in many of the global markets by several of the purchasers. The sort of demand side wants to make sure, again with the uncertainty that the president of the chamber pointed to, that they're not left undone. So I think you will start to see prices go up, and on the shipping side, prices have started going up already. In fact, in the US, in the testimonies, we heard that there were several sectors that were having difficulties booking vessels because everyone wanted to get in before the April 17th deadline, which is when the US is supposed to make its announcement. So that is going to create some more difficulties and challenges for us. So I did say, for the established plants, we'll see an increase in the cost, certainly of goods and services. We'll also see an impact on the bookings.
Okay.
And if we haven't started to see an impact on the bookings yet, again, the Chamber's president is absolutely correct. That big C word, confidence. People are becoming very unsure about the future. And so it's not just the car, but they're postponing taking vacations. And so we're going to see a fall off, I anticipate, in the next quarter or so with tourism bookings, certainly from the United States market. And of course, what we will have to do, I like the word to pivot, to other markets. But even when we pivot to the Canadian market, they too are having their challenges. It's not a good time globally, but we're going to have to start looking at other markets where I think for the next, certainly for the next foreseeable future, we will have to look at that. But I will also tell you that in addition to this, we will also see some changes, and we are very lucky in the OECS with the fixed parity between the EC dollar and the US.
Right.
But that's another impact that certain countries have to be very concerned about. And now with all of this, the knock-on effects on the sector is going to be tremendous. I want to pause there because I think I don't want to do too much stargazing in terms of what all the deleterious impacts are going to be. But certainly on projects that are approved but not yet built, there is in fact a tremendous level of uncertainty about what the build cost would be.
Right.
And in countries like Barbados, where you have 6 hotels approved for construction, and in Jamaica, I know it's causing a great deal of trepidation because you're not sure where this will land. And the reason for that is that the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association's data show that about 30-something% of the imports, right, the fixtures and the finishings and the fine details that you want to put in your rooms, comes from the United States, and a lot of those are imported from other countries into the US. Again, we go back to the same problem, right? So that's really where I think we are. So the impact on tourism is going to be a knock. Mm-hmm. It will take a knock, and we have to plan for it. And I think we have certainly to position ourselves to minimize the impact on the sector.
Okay. Let me just ask you this. My information is that when Secretary of State Mark Rubio was in Jamaica recently, you sought an audience with him. One, did you get an audience with him? And whether or not you did, what really was the focus of the conversation as you looked to have that audience?
No, well, we operate strictly within the CARICOM framework, and what we did is that we had meetings prior to the engagement between heads and Secretary of State Rubio. Mm-hmm. Those engagements, I think the CARICOM heads acted properly in preparing themselves with all the information necessary to engage, including OECS prime ministers that would, of course, would have passed their concerns to Prime Minister Motley, who is the chair, and also to their counterparts. So we didn't engage directly, but we know that the material that we developed, not just from the CPSO, but from the CARICOM Secretariat's professionals, from the hoteliers, and we had a call which had a record-breaking, 700 and something entities on that call, preparing for this. We know that the brief was properly delivered because on the other side, we've gotten word that the intervention by the heads certainly has registered. Where it will land, we can't yet see. But we know that the intervention of CARICOM heads has certainly registered in lifting this, right, to the right kind of crescendo that needs to be heard by the president. We also heard that Prime Minister Motley, in her capacity as chair, did write to the President of the United States on these issues. And so I think in terms of organizing themselves for the engagement, and certainly I liked my colleague's term for the advocacy, I think the heads have done a good job. So I just wanted to say that because it's important that we continue to remain aligned in what we do, and the CPSO we have ensured that this alignment has remained, even with Colin's institution. We met with them on the Friday before we left to give testimony in the United States. So we've remained aligned on all fronts, and I'm very pleased about that. And I would like to see that alignment continued, and not to have countries break rank, as we've seen some years ago on issues of this nature.
Okay. It is time, viewers and listeners, for our first break, so we'll go to a commercial break and come back and continue the discussion of the impact or possible impact of the U.S. tariffs on our Caribbean economies. See you shortly.
Need to install or repair your plumbing? We've got you covered. Whether you're setting up a new washing machine, replacing a leaking faucet, or fixing that pesky dripping pipe, the Plumbing Supply Store is your go-to place in Grenada. We offer a wide range of plumbing products to make both new installations and maintenance a breeze. Our shelves are stocked with top quality products including pressure and waste fittings. And if you've been struggling with blocked drains, have you heard of Melt? This powerful drain-unblocker liquid is a game changer, designed to prevent and clear blockages, making it ideal for hairdressers dealing with clogged wash sinks. We also carry a wide selection of repair kits and replacement parts to bring new life to all plumbing fixtures. Visit us today on the Woodlands Main Road or call 444-1377 for expert advice, top-notch products, and a warm welcome. At the Supply Store, we do everything plumbing.
Have you heard about the new Softweave bathroom tissue with total hygiene? As hygiene and safety have taken center stage, our bathroom tissue is now manufactured with 3 different technologies to offer the best protection for you and your family. UVC light technology for a safe and effective disinfection process, eliminating 99.9% of microorganisms. Also, production at high temperatures, killing all types of germs and bacteria. And it's pH controlled with delicate fibers to prevent irritation for even sensitive skin. Softweave Total Hygiene Bathroom Tissue, available in supermarkets and shops island-wide. Visit Softweave Caribbean Facebook or Instagram pages for more information.
Grenada, get ready for a fantastic opportunity as the Grenada Cultural Foundation presents a logo design competition. So we're asking the general public to submit a creative and impactful logo to identify with the foundation's new brand, using its vision and mission as a guide to become Grenada's premier institute for researching, documenting, and promoting Grenada's culture. Mission to be the gateway to cultural empowerment to Grenada's cultural practitioners. The winning logo will be announced on Wednesday, April 30th, 2025, and the winner will be awarded $1,500. All entries should be forwarded via the following email address: gcfgrenada@gmail.com, and should be received no later than 12 midnight on Tuesday, April 15th.
Viewers and listeners, we're wrestling with the potential impact of the U.S. tariffs on Caribbean economies and businesses, well, and certainly and the population. Kinta Kunte, as we've been looking at stock markets throughout the world, not just in the U.S., we've been seeing nosedives and consecutive days of it going down. What do these tariffs have in mind, do you believe, for the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union in general, and also the Eastern Caribbean Stock Exchange in particular? We, of course, will have to expand our conversation. We start off with the Eastern Caribbean Stock Exchange, but we do know we have exchanges in Jamaica, Trinidad, and we want to examine those as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think we have already highlighted a cause, a potential kickback factor, and that's uncertainty. Investors love predictability and they love uncertainty. If I can see and I can predict that you're going to sell 5 mangoes, I can invest in your company simply because I know that, right? We have reliability with all the financial statements, and all of these are put in place to ensure, in addition to the multilateral trade system, which is a rules-based system, which ensures predictability, to ensure some kind of certainty. What these tariffs do is that they remove all manner of certainty. And so people are plunged into uncertainty. And what do people tend to do when they're uncertain? They pull back. They become very conservative. They become very risk averse because they're not sure what they're getting. And I think the potential kickback for the ECSC is that stocks may plummet. We have to be prepared for that. Why is that? Because U.S. investors all over the world are thinking, okay, that holding that I have in this company, those stocks that I have in these companies in the Caribbean, they're going to expect indirect kickbacks from the tariffs. We're already talking about it. And so the question is, how do we mitigate those effects? How do we have a resilient economy or resilient private sector that can weather these effects? I think that's a question going forward, but certainly we can be prepared to expect some kind of falling in that regard.
We have, Colin, a number of Grenadian companies listed. I believe Grenlec is listed Grenada Cooperative Bank, I believe, is also listed. Any conversations within the chamber of what we can, or what they're expecting as a result of these changes?
No, I can't say we've had direct conversations with them on what the impact on their stock price would be, but it's something certainly that the chamber would be very quick to have a discussion on with them around what they see as investor confidence in their stock, right? My personal view is I'm not sure how much of an impact the tariffs would have on the ECSC, for instance, simply because of what we've said earlier on. A lot of this really impacts companies in the agricultural sector from the tariff side, and a lot of the other SMEs are not listed. Those that are listed, for example, the big ones, you have, say, Ansa Macal, Sagicor, and Massey, and so forth. I think they're doing just what governments are supposed to be doing. They're looking at different markets and seeing how they're going to be innovative, how they're going to pivot to be prepared for any shocks that come as a result of the tariffs. And so they may be in this for the long haul, and it's really how we see this playing out. They're pulling together, they're in the different markets, and they're seeing how they leverage their strength to be able to withstand any sort of shock from the markets.
Patrick, your outlook on the Eastern Caribbean Stock Exchange. Of course, you will be able to look at the other exchanges within the region. And if you can let us know whether there is any reinvestment in the U.S., because sometimes, it is about building wealth. So have we, through the ECCU and otherwise, reinvested in the U.S., and then we can be in trouble as well? You're muted.
I am open here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, for the reason that Colin mentioned, that is the limited exposure of the ECSC to a large extent. We are, I want to say, in the short term, and I want to address this in that way, we're not going to see a great deal of let me say, a lot of that volatility is not going to impact earnings, right? And for certainly for our exchange, and for the reason too, that we don't have a lot of firms listed, on the exchange. And the regional securities exchange, where we have paper from governments, etc., etc. Those are fixed rates, and I don't see those being impacted either. I want to just put that in the mix. In the case of the other stock exchanges, to the extent that a lot of them are closely held and are based on assets that are within CARICOM, I'm not seeing a big impact there, save and except for persons who invest in those exchanges from outside wanting to pull funds for the fear factor. And that's largely going to be an issue in an exchange like Jamaica, where you have a large Jamaican diaspora investing in the exchange in Jamaica. And again, we have to watch that. It's early days yet, because what goes down must come up. And I think many people learned that from COVID. Many people are still trying to recover from pulling their funds early during COVID for fear, and have not been able to recover at the level that they presume. So I just wanted to say that in terms of the exchanges, but we have to look to see what those impacts are going to be. For the big companies, let me say that the fundamentals have not changed. Even in the United States, the truth is that it's fair, right? And fair. This what we call the volatility index is inversely related to like the indicators. So the S&P goes down, volatility goes up.
Right.
And I think that's what we're seeing, right? And of course, the market reacts and volatility goes up, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think we have to wait in CARICOM and see what the impact is going to be. But I have to tell you, the entities that have funds invested in the U.S. market, and I'm talking about the pension funds. Many of the NISs have 10 or 20% of their portfolio invested in U.S. equities. these are nervous times for them because they have an investment committee, which if not exercising the proper discipline, I'm afraid these are not times for the faint-hearted, and pulling funds, certainly for companies that are performing, is certainly not the best stroke at this time. I mean, and those of us in economics know that, because I think what's happening in the United States, it's absolutely disastrous, and we don't know how long it will last. But if the fundamentals are strong, then I think we have to look at stocks and bonds as a long-term investment. And some very careful computations need to be made about what move we want to make as small countries investing in those big markets where the fundamentals of the companies remain strong, but the environment that they're operating, of course, is quite turbulent. And I see that because, again, these are issues that we have to grapple with. So I'm concerned about pension funds. That's where my big concern is right now.
Okay, I heard that, and I know you can't say it, but basically I would say what I'm hearing is that whole strain, right? As Dr. Antoine said, what goes down must come back up. And there is, for the conspiracy theorists, some believe that some of the behaviors that we are seeing is to drive stocks down. Some people buy up all, and then when it rebounds, their wealth increases astronomically. So let's be part of that upward crest as well. How will, and this is an open question, how will our relationship with the following countries be impacted? How are we to treat with China? How are we to treat with Canada? How are we to treat with the UK? Colin, I don't know if you want to kick us off here. Just as we look at this environment, how would you advise companies and our CARICOM member states to think of our relationships with China, with Canada, with the UK?
Oh, geez, you're asking me to draw on my foreign affairs skills, which I have none. But certainly, we have to be mindful of how we go about our interactions with other foreign powers, especially the ones that you mentioned are big players on the global markets, right? And we benefit a lot from those countries. So the question is, do we forge a deeper alliance with them that makes sense for us? Some may argue, yep, that's the way to go, because if you have one foreign power saying it's their first policy, they're putting themselves first, then obviously it's for the region to do the same thing and align themselves with persons who have an interest in their well-being. So that's one way of looking at it, but I think fundamentally we need to look at new areas of investment. We need to look at new areas, new trade partners. There's been a lot of focus in CARICOM on the African continent, for instance, and we certainly need to open our eyes. No longer can any private sector business rely 100% on what I would like to call the traditional trade routes, right? And if no one sees this now, then we're really setting ourselves up for failure in the future. Now is the time to really go out there, go to the trade fairs and get your product out there, because one door is slowly closing and making it very difficult to do business.
Okay. Kente Conte, your thoughts?
Yeah, I fully agree. One of the quintessential ways to hedge risk is to diversify your markets and to diversify your sources of income. The idea that I think that we must embrace is blockism, in essence, CARICOM. And the president said it best. We need to tackle this from a regional perspective, because if we look at ourselves individually, we're sure to be toppled. And George Brazan had this beautiful booklet by the name of Mercantilism, or New Mercantilism and the Export of Wealth. And in it, he posited that the export of wealth is kind of like a neo-colonialist kind of paradigm, where we as small island developing states must come to the epiphany, the realization that individually we are being stomped, but together where regionalism might just be the answer to our global woes. And so I think we need to treat with these world powers as a bloc and not necessarily as individual countries and entities. Because certainly when we have the reciprocal nature of multilateralism, these cheaper commodities will come into and flood our markets, and it will put our private sector out of business. So we need to face it as a bloc. That way, when the cheaper goods do come in because of the relationship that we'll be forming, we're going to be able and ready to hedge it.
Okay. All right. Treating it as a bloc, Patrick, your thoughts?
Yeah, so we are facing the question frontally. CARICOM has to continue in its approach of dealing with partners in this increasingly multipolar world by engagements, as we just heard from Kunta Kinte, through the community. And the treaty was made for that. The revised Treaty of Chaguaramas talks about a relationship that is in a concentric circle, which is the CSME, and the third countries and groupings. And I think where we have been able to commit to this, we've done well. But I'm not naive. We have some countries that pledged allegiance to Taiwan and others to the Republic of China, and they feel that they have done well too. So that I think what has to happen is that we have to ensure that in what we do there is a harmonized approach, even where we're going to have countries determining on their own that they want to take individual positions, and those individual positions must not interfere with the sort of positions of the community, of the group as a bloc. And that is why there is in fact now a protocol before the heads of government on how we deal with enhanced cooperation, where some countries want to do something that doesn't violate the treaty, such as on foreign policy, or to engage in a deeper form of integration where others are not yet interested. So we have to ensure that that is the case. But I just wanted to say that the days of multilateralism is dead. Let me repeat this today. The term multilateralism now has absolutely no meaning, and I'm not sure it's going to have any meaning for another decade or so, because the damage that's been done, which begun not just with President Trump, but begun when the United States administration didn't hire an appellant judge to the dispute settlement body at the WTO. That damage, which is now, I think, risen to a level that really is astounding, that damage is not going to be undone anytime soon. So we're going to be living in an era of regionalism where it's going to be CARICOM Mercosur, CARICOM Grupo Andino, CARICOM, the Africa grouping. That's where we're going to be living. Regionalism is what is going to drive this now, because I don't think we're going back to multilateralism anytime soon. And I think what we need to do in CARICOM is to, first of all, build out the strength of this integration grouping so that we're in a stronger position to engage with other groupings and other countries.
Let me ask you this, because if we're saying multilateralism is dead, how do we incentivize CARICOM to continue to serve as a bloc? Why don't they go and take advantage as individual countries to the Belt and Road project offered by China and forge alliances and allegiances with the likes of Nigeria as we attempt to get into the African continent? So how do we keep CARICOM in line, recognizing that WTO has been undermined and this multilateral relationship that we once could have depended on is probably no more?
Well, let's remember that the CARICOM arrangement was always intended to be a deeper arrangement amongst ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. Freedom of movement of goods, freedom of movement of capital, freedom of movement of persons, freedom of movement of ideas, a single company registry, harmonized legislation. All of these are things that we committed to And were it not for the fact that I think we've been tardy, we ought to have achieved that by now. And so I want to be very clear, deeper than any grouping, only similar to the European Union. That is what will give us the strength. In fact, if you look at the trade data, you will see that the CARICOM internal market has tremendous opportunities that we have not tapped into. So CARICOM trade is not insignificant. In the case of agriculture, it's about 23% of our trade is amongst ourselves. And this is even with the presence of non-tariff barriers where, for instance, we still haven't solved this vexing matter of Grenada's honey being exported to Trinidad. We haven't solved the matter of Suriname's duck meat being exported to Trinidad and Tobago. We haven't solved problems with how we deal with trading protocols. So we've not performed well. But the strength of CARICOM has been proven by the way in which we have gotten good results when we've stuck together. When CARICOM stuck together, which is coming back from the non-aligned movement, we've done very well. When we've gone individually, we've done well for a while. And we see that after a while, the bigger countries tend to take smaller countries for granted. That's just the way it's been. It's
Colin
not socialism, it's not capitalism.
Okay, Colin, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and that's, those are very good points being raised by Dr. Antoine, right? You think of CARICOM, I think CARICOM is somewhere either the third, CARICOM as a whole is either the third or the fifth largest trading partner for the US. So if we don't pull together as one, as a bloc, to negotiate, we're just being pulled apart. That's the first thing. We talk about building deeper ties with other countries, which is all, it's fair to do that. And it is one of the avenues we should explore. But how about building deeper ties through a framework that we already have in place? And removing those barriers that we have, and some of them very low-hanging fruit. As a CARICOM national, I can go to the US with my driver's license and not have to go through the paperwork of having an additional permit given to me to rent a car. But yet, when I go to some of the CARICOM countries, I need a permit, even though I present a CARICOM-issued driver's license. You look at, in many instances, the barriers to travel, for instance. It's a lot easier and in some instances more cost-effective to go through Miami and then come back into the region as opposed to moving from one island to another within CARICOM. Those are important issues we have to deal with and remove those barriers, because if we're saying persons or tourists from the US are going to delay their vacation and come to the Caribbean, and we know a lot of our CARICOM economies depend on tourism, it's the main driver of GDP. Why aren't we making it easier for persons within our region, those 15 to 18 million people in CARICOM as a whole, why aren't we making it easier? That $90 billion US of GDP that we have as a bloc, why aren't we leveraging that amongst ourselves to make things easier and help us absorb some of those shocks? We will not be so exposed to external forces or the whims of other world powers.
I experience the pain that you're just speaking because I do a lot of my work in the Northern Caribbean, and Miami is my home. I would leave it at that. I was about to call where I sleep, but I wouldn't be doing any free advertising on air. But Patrick, you'll go through the same thing that Colin just experienced. In order to traverse the Caribbean, quite often, Miami is your outpost.
Yeah, and we talk about
they say Miami is the region's integration point, unfortunately, because we do have very clear studies which prove out that there are other hubs which we now see the wisdom of investing in those hubs, and we see the folly of not having invested in those hubs in the past.
Right.
We have studies that tell us that Jamaica is a strong hub. They have the infrastructure now. They've gone ahead and built out port infrastructure. in a way that can handle a lot of the volumes from CARICOM. We know that Trinidad has been tardy in terms of making itself what Panama is today. It's another hub, though, for logistics and shipping routes, and Barbados is a possible third hub, and also a spoke in our community. But we haven't done our work well, and we've not done our work well for all sorts of let me say idiosyncratic reasons, which member states have held near and dear to themselves for some time. So you can have, for instance, as we've had over time, a foreign carrier coming and being actually designated as a national carrier, but a regional carrier wanting the same thing, being denied that opportunity. We're paying for that now. We're paying for putting non-tariff barriers in place, which we have at the CPSO level, done a document on and actually presented it to heads, and they've endorsed and have committed to removing them again. But all this time, while we're talking about removing barriers, we have goods coming in from the United States with absolutely no infringement and no impediments at all. We're paying for that now. We're also paying for the fact that we've not empowered our private sector in a lot of the countries, either for fear of their sort of economic power because they become too independent, or because we've just essentially preferred, for one reason or another, to maintain the supply chains out of the region. And so we have, for instance, milling capacity. Let me talk about milling, flour and feed in this region. That is double times the demand that we have inside CARICOM. But many countries don't want to do what is required to sort of engage the excess capacity by essentially giving our domestic enterprises an opportunity to build it out by limiting the imports from third countries, not illegally, because when you look at what the countries do outside, we've measured it. The supports they get, our firms don't get. But we're paying for that now. We are now struggling with how, if the U.S. starts having difficulties with pork and beef, how is our tourism sector going to survive? But Suriname and Belize can produce all the pork the region needs. We have had a dairy and a beef industry that we've killed. And so we're paying for a lot of those missteps now as a community. But it's not too late for us to re-engage them. That's what we're talking about, building first. And then we build, Colin, we have something to trade. We have something to talk to Panama about. We have something to talk to Mexico about. But at the moment, what we are really is a group of, it's defined, net food importing developing countries and net importing countries. And to solve that, we have to work and build it out. I heard you earlier.
All right. It is time for a final break, viewers and listeners. So we will take our break, and when we come back, you certainly can give your contributions. 440-1252. That's the number for you to weigh in. See you shortly.
Attention all divers, snorkelers and underwater enthusiasts. Effective May 15th, 2025, all visitors to the renowned Mullinair Underwater Sculpture Park will be required to pay a small fee of US $3.50 or EC $10 per person. These fees are essential to support the ongoing maintenance and repairs of the sculptures, as well as the development of new features to ensure the park remains a world-class attraction. Payment can be made through the Grenada Tourism Authority's online payment portal, available on the Pure Grenada website, www.puregrenada.com. We thank you for your support in enhancing this extraordinary underwater product. This announcement is brought to you by the Grenada Tourism Authority and the Ministry of Tourism, dedicated to protecting and conserving Grenada's resources for the enjoyment of all.
Agritech Limited Grenada is your one-stop shop for all your farming needs. We provide seeds and seedlings, pesticides, fertilizers, irrigation and water management systems, veterinary products, and a wide range of agricultural products and implements. Our staff is knowledgeable and ready to serve you. Call us on 435-9677 or 440-4460 or visit us in Happy Hill, St. George. We are open Monday to Saturday, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and on Sundays, 6 a.m. to 1 p.m. Agritech Limited Grenada. Come grow with us.
Boy, yo, they gonna fly with kite now. The wind picking up. I'm coming. Karim, what you doing? Fly my kite. Yeah, but not here. You can't fly kite near power lines, boy. Why not? The wind good. Because mommy say kite threads conduct electricity.
Yeah, kite. He's right. If your kite gets stuck in power lines, it can cause power outages, or even worse, it can get shocked.
Come, let's go and fly them in the pasture.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Grenlink, energizing our Grenada.
Welcome back, viewers and listeners. We're looking at the potential impact of U.S. tariffs on Caribbean economies. You certainly can weigh in 440-1252. That's the number that you can call in. We do have a caller online already. Good evening, caller. Welcome.
Good evening, gentlemen. I must indeed commend this evening's program. It's a marvelous one, very good information, Mr. Antoine. Perfectly done, all the panelists. I have a little concern. It's a curious question. Here it goes. The United States, of course, is instigating all this chaos around the world. And in certain levels, because this term hasn't been used here this evening, but some people, economists, etc., believe that they are quote-unquote shooting themselves in the foot. My question is, does the implementation of these tariffs on the peoples, whether in the Caribbean or around the world, affect the United States companies, whether it be franchise or direct companies in these other countries? Does it affect them in any additionally negative ways? Other than the normal thing dealing with country to country, does it affect these U.S.-owned firms in other countries in any negative way? I trust my question is understood.
Thank you very much. Dr. Antoine, you want to take that one on?
Yes. The caller raises a very provocative question. The answer is, from an economic perspective, yes, most definitely. If you are in the United States, which is the really troubling thing for even economists today, even for things the U.S. does not produce, they've put tariffs on. So, bananas, for instance, from Dowe, right? You're paying more for bananas. You're paying more for Grenadian soursop. Colin didn't mention soursop. That's about our third largest export to the U.S. Our fifth largest export would be things like cocoa and chocolate and cocoa-containing products. Again, you're paying more for that. And in a real sense, what's going to happen across the board is inflation in the United States. But there are also going to be shortages because many of the U.S. successful enterprises depend on what we call is inter-industry trade, where you import lots of different bits and pieces to make a product, right? Colin and both Collins mentioned that. And of course, the cost of those products that are made will in fact increase, and wages aren't keeping pace, certainly for the middle class and for the ordinary folk in the United States, as rapidly as the price increases. So there are going to be tremendous negative implications, and many sectors in the United States, the agricultural sector in the United States are begging, they're saying, please don't do this, right? This is not good for us. This is not good for us because in addition to what you've done, and I'm going to stop here, other countries are now putting tariffs on our exports to them. And that drives up the cost for us too. So, we are in a very vicious cycle. where there is no good end to this. And I talked about the hypothesis of solving the trade deficit. But the results coming out from an economic study done and published last week is that if the US collected all the revenue from the tariffs, it would only fund the federal government for 2 weeks. It would fund the federal government for 2 weeks. Not for 2 months, but for 2 weeks. And I wanted to leave that bit of information there because it makes absolutely no sense. And President Bush is hoping, President Trump is hoping it brings other people to the table. It's doing some other things as well.
Right. And what is also interesting, and you gentlemen can respond to this, is part of the thrust is Buy American and to help to energize the American industries. But you hear the cry from, let's say, car dealerships, because the good American car imports parts to build the good American car. And there are tariffs that are imposed on those, and hence the price of the American car, because you want to emphasize American goods, but the price of American car has just gone up by 10% or whatever it is, and affecting the American citizens' pocket.
Yeah, I'm not sure how first America can be when we have such a globalized world and such interconnected supply chains. So I think that's why we're seeing the negative drawback even on American companies. For example, Tesla, their stock dropped and their sales declined simply because of the tariffs. And President Trump, in a recent interview or comment, said, be patient. And talking to his citizens, he said, be patient. So that is essentially the trade policy. Let us dish out these tariffs, be patient, because it's going to work.
And what Patrick indicated is that part of the motive of the tariffs is bringing people to the table. So we're looking at now not the multilateral world, but the bilateral agreements. Do you see this working?
I think based on the responses we're seeing right now, I would question whether it's working as effective as the president thought that it would have. Because some countries have said, hey, I will have reciprocal tariffs on you, and yes, we will discuss, but we're going to discuss a trade deal that is mutually beneficial to both countries.
We've also seen some movement on some non-tariff regulations. China is a classic example of that, which would impact on the technology industry within the U.S.
Right. Yes. So when we talk about let's push consumers within the U.S. to push U.S. goods, there's so many goods that have components from and technology is a huge one, right? Places from Taiwan, China, and so forth, and you're really putting things in place now to have the cost of those goods increasing. You're reducing the spending power of the average American, and Dr. Antoine mentioned earlier on, even the pensions are taking a hit at this point. So how are you going to tell your people to be patient when they have to live now? Right? And those are the discussions. And on the agriculture side, there's actually a bit of a double whammy, because you have the reciprocal tariffs being placed on things like oranges or things coming off the shelf, liquor, agricultural products coming off the shelf. But you also have the large immigration shift, where you're deporting those very people who work in the agricultural fields for a lot less than you would have to pay an American employee for their labor. Right, so you're naturally increasing the cost of that, and then you're stuck with tariffs. So it's a bit of a mix-up.
Is this a good opportunity for CARICOM citizens to be even more patriotic? We see the Canadians saying we're pulling American goods off of the shelves and encouraging, of course, to buy Canadian. So whereas the emphasis in the U.S. or the starting point, let us build America and make America great again, is this an opportunity for making the CARICOM great?
Yeah, so let me take that. The answer is certainly there is a strong basis in economics and in trade for CARICOM doing more, to produce more, and to have our people buy more of our quality products. Jamaica exports a whole range of products to the United States, and I've said it to them, so I know that the news travels. They have only just begun looking south. Their products were going to Miami. You could find them in Fort Lauderdale. You can find them in Georgia. But quality Jamaican products you just could not find in the Southern Caribbean. Trinidad and Tobago has penetrated quite a few of the markets, but even their products aren't widely diffused. What you've had instead is lots of products from many other countries. And in Grenada, we have tremendous capacity that we now need to liberate, right? I've been very open about this fact that, we need to do some really deep thinking about some of our sources of competitive and comparative advantage. One of those sources.
Patrick, we do have a caller online, so let's take the caller. Yes. And I certainly remember the point you're making, so I'll get back to that. Good evening, caller. Welcome. It seems as though we lost the caller. But they will call back, and caller, please do, and we will take you immediately when you do. But Patrick, you're asking us to do some soul searching as to where our comparative and competitive advantages lie. Oh, we have a next caller. Let me tell you. So let's go on with the caller. Good evening, caller. Welcome.
Good night, gentlemen. Yeah, I want to do Patrick Antoine. On CARICOM investment. Give me some know about CARICOM investment, boss, if you don't mind.
All right, so that there's a call for a separate consultancy on the CARICOM issue. Just as we speak to the competitive and comparative advantages that Grenada ought to identify and exploit. Go ahead.
Yeah, but and I want to also answer that, because I think what we're finding now is that there are several things that we've had advantages on. For instance, the nutmeg sector that we've never built out. I think Kunta Kinte spoke about George Brazan, and it seems as though, despite a lot of very good policy indications from the government, signals, we're not seeing a lot of uptake on the ground to rehabilitate the nutmeg industry. There are other countries in CARICOM, which will remain unnamed, that are now trying to position themselves as the Isle of Spice. A lot of the advantages that we've had on the cocoa side, we've had tremendous devastations, but the uptake for products on the international markets, and we haven't even begun to scratch the surface, has been strong. Now, let me tell you that where we're going to now in this world is where you're paying nearly $4 for a pound of Jamaican yellow yam. That was before the tariffs, right? So that none of these ventures we can take as we did in the past and think, well, look, they're too small for us or insignificant. The world wants quality. The world wants differentiation. And we have come from the country that was once the most diversified agricultural producer in CARICOM. And I'm not sure I like what I see now. It's been going on for a while. And I just make the point that those are some of the things we need to now start digging deep to see how we can bring all of those resources together. And on the investment side, we've really not had very good investment opportunities in the Eastern Caribbean. And that is why many persons, including myself, would have invested in instruments, because we were actually not given all the correct information from the regulators in the various countries. And many times the regulators, as you know the case in Trinidad and Tobago, where there was a tussle between the regulator and the central bank, so the information was never transmitted to us transparently, where the fund and the investments were insolvent. And what we have to do, which is why I'm so passionate about the regional stock exchange, is we need to build out the architecture for these things so that ordinary people are not ever subjected to this level of unfairness again. Because ultimately, what we've seen is that he who holds the assets leverages it in a way that benefits himself and his people. And I make no apology for this view, because we've suffered at the end of that. So that's why I want to speak to the caller about this. What's been done to us is an injustice. I did say to us, because I unfortunately lost a substantial sum as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another caller online. Good evening, caller. Welcome. Go ahead, caller, and listen through your telephone, please. Not the radio, not the television, only your telephone, and speak to us. We're hearing you.
Hi, geniuses. How are we going forward? Mr. Patrick, your panel, everybody are cool. You don't feel like we just supposed to focus on, forget about all this big entity and focus about how we growing like a country, like a nation together. There's different other entities in Grenada. Mr. Patrick, I like what you did. What I'm saying, are we building entities in terms of local development? In segments like where we have factories, we have a lot of things in Grenada where you could utilize. Because if you look sharp, the outside world is switching away from us. And they already switched. No, we, like a nation and a country, we have to develop in that segment.
All right. Thank you very much, caller. And this is a table. The caller's point is that we need to look inward. And Patrick did make the point in terms of where do our comparative and competitive advantages lie. $4 US for a pound of yellow yam, but they can leverage that the yellow yam from Trelawney that caused Usain Bolt to be the hero he is, right? So that branding is important. But we do have Granny James from the Isle of Spice, and Grenada will be that. So how do we leverage the bill industries as indicated by the caller? And President of the Chamber.
I think you have to look at the whole ecosystem, right? We can go ahead and we can build industries and we can set up micro factories to do everything from dry goods and other items that we know CARICOM needs, right? But the wider picture, I think that the larger picture there is how do we leverage the relationships that we have? How do we remove those barriers to entry to our neighbors? And also transportation is a key thing, right? How are we going to transport goods from one CARICOM country to another without being bogged down by a whole ton of
goods and people, because
goods and people, right? Well, we seem to be working on the people part. There's a framework for that, but I think even the movement of goods and the infrastructure around it, whether you're going to have ferries to do it, whether you're going to have aviation and so forth, how are you going to move simple things as storage? Okay. If you're moving fish from one to another, how are you going to have storage for that? So
we have another caller online. Good evening, caller. Welcome. Go ahead, caller. We are waiting on you.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, it's important that once you get through with the call, you listen only on the telephone because there'll be a delay on the television. Go ahead, caller, we're hearing you.
Yes, it's Lance Garraway calling. First off, I want to congratulate you, Colin Dowe, for selecting an excellent panel. Colin Francis, and
go ahead, caller. We're hearing you clearly. You just go ahead.
Sorry, yes. I just wanted to compliment you and the panel for doing an excellent job, especially my past student, Dr. Antoine. And I'm especially glad to hear of the progress being made for the regional stock exchange.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm speaking. Yes.
All right. The message here, callers in general, is that once you get answered, you listen through the telephone, there's at least in some cases a 15-second delay between what is coming through the television and the conversation. So ignore the television or the radio, please, once you are making a call, only on the telephone. Who can be or who ought to lead this CARICOM initiative? Two things. One, for us to support each other, who does what best to supply the region, because that is how we can actually achieve efficiencies. And as we look externally, who should be the face of CARICOM negotiating with the US, for example, in this scenario, but as we look towards the African continent, etc. Do you have any thoughts, Kinta Kunti? And I would then certainly ask Dr. Antoine thereafter.
Well, I would love to hear Dr. Antoine's nomination. But as for me, I would say I have two candidates off the top of my head. Of course, we have President His Excellency Dr. Irfan Ali, and we also have PM Mia Motley. And I think as CARICOM chair, she is poised. She has spoken very articulately and saliently on these points way before in the UN and so on and so forth. So I'm leaning more to Barbados, Bridgetown for this intervention.
Dr. Antoine?
Yeah, so let me take it this way. I think there are two models for how we do this quote-unquote negotiation. Who goes first, right? So Kunta Kinte in the ASEAN group, it's the private sector that leads. And the private sector, they make the deals, and then they go to governments. And the governments then come on board with the agreements. So that's one model. The other model is to have governments lead, and then ask the question, well, private sector, why haven't you taken advantage of all that we've negotiated, right? And we've seen that model as well. So I think the ideal thing for us in CARICOM is to do what increasingly is being done now, which is that the private sector and governments working together, and who leads it, of course, really doesn't matter as much, because what you do, as the heads have done in preparing for the engagement with Secretary of State Rubio, is that you prepare yourself, you prepare your brief, you prepare your interest, you know what your first strategy is and what your back pocket strategy is. You want to make sure that you have both the private sector and governments engaged in this process, which is what Prime Minister Motley endeared us to do when she had her statement recently, calling on the private sector and calling on the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association and so on to get together and try to do what it must to solve this crisis. And of course, because the CPSO embodies all of the private sector and all its dispensations, right? We're happy to be here. We don't displace what Colin is doing in Grenada. All we do is bring the analytical capacity to work with Colin and his team and others, like Colin's institution at the Chamber that are BSOs, in identifying the opportunities and sitting with governments and saying, okay, look, we as private sector believe that this is interesting for us. Let's make it happen. That becomes your negotiating brief. So I've given you, Kunta Kinte, I think what is in fact a third model, and it less depends on whether there is a Prime Minister Motley there, though she is fantastic, I must agree. It could be Prime Minister Mitchell, someone else who leads on this. I just wanted to leave that with you.
Let me ask you this, though. Is there trust among CARICOM leaders? And I say this from the standpoint, we saw Secretary of State flying into Jamaica, and it always seems, certainly to me, let me make it personal and not general, that Jamaica is an easy peel-off of CARICOM, and certainly within the U.S. context, they always begin conversations there. There is sometimes political alignments between political parties, etc. Is there trust among the leaders that there can really be a CARICOM response to this challenge?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. There is no question that our countries do have certain leanings and relationships that exist in certain directions. That is undeniable. It would be dishonest of me not to be very frank about that. But I think the strength of CARICOM is that the colleagues, the prime ministers, have always been able to get over these divides. And I think having the divides actually is what strengthens the CARICOM coalition. You know, some are actually leaning in one direction, some in another, still others in a third or fourth direction. It is that solidarity that exists among the prime ministers, notwithstanding the fact that they may not have identical leanings, and I'm using leanings deliberately to be apolitical, is what is in fact the strength of our community. And I hope that never changes. I mean, the day when they're all aligned in one direction is a day when we would find ourselves not being able to respond in a multipolar world. And I just wanted to leave that there with you because I think that certainly is the case. There are frictions, but the frictions are healthy.
Okay, thank you. Colin, I know you wanted to add to this.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you take a look at the CARICOM team, as I call them, there is a focus. And I think we're seeing an intense focus now because we have commonalities. We are under threat. And so we now have to make sure we come together to protect what's under threat. So there are more common threads than ever before. And so you're seeing that coalesce into this partnership, for lack of a better word. I want to also tag back on the previous comment about the private sector leading it. And I remember in March, the Chamber had the Prime Minister address us and the membership. And one of the things that stood out was his call to the private sector to get more involved in politics. And what he meant was not, get up, leave your business and come run for office.
He wasn't looking for competition.
No. No, and he made that clear. but what he was saying is he was making a plea and saying, hey, those things that impact you, come talk about it. Scream. Don't suffer in silence. Let us know whether we're doing it. Come with your ideas, right, and let's put them to good use. And from that, what was born. Tomorrow we have another consultation between the government and the private sector. It's tomorrow at the Trade Center from 1:00, and that's where that came from. It's a drive where the government is saying, let's get the private sector involved, because they're acutely aware you need the private sector if you're going on the world stage to negotiate for businesses and for your economy. The private sector is your backbone, and in Grenada more so, because you have upward of 60% MSMEs in Grenada, and a lot of them are family owned and create jobs for the ordinary people, and the money flows to the ordinary people, and you need that.
Right. Gentlemen, it's closing time almost, so it's final comments, right? So Kinta Kunte, I would lead with you. I will then come to Patrick and Colin. Because you're Colin, you get the final word. All right? So yeah. Kinta Kunte, maybe advice or certainly a wish as to how you would like us to move forward as a country, as a region.
Well, I am grieving the death of my dear multilateralism. I am reeling from the effects of this rule-based system, which George Brazan so articulately stated that has been created for the benefit of the world powers. We have been made to fit into that mold, and now the rug is being pulled out from beneath us, and so these rules never mattered in the first place. So I say, going forward, we need policy, innovation, harmonization. I love the step that CARICOM took with the enhanced partnership, where countries who desire deeper integration among themselves, Jamaica just signed it, can pursue that, and so other countries who are not willing or not ready for that kind of deeper integration can wait or take a longer time to join that. So I see a joint policy and harmonized policy framework being the way forward for us to really hedge this very much existential threat.
Okay. Patrick?
Yeah, the region faces an unprecedented level of threat to its economic prosperity at this time. In addition to what's been already meted out to us by way of the United States reciprocal tariffs, there is a looming threat that the US's measures against Chinese vessels due for announcement on April the 17th, if nothing changes by way of them acceding to the request of CARICOM heads and the community for an exemption, will lead to another layer of taxes and burden on the people of our community. This is a time for our community to dig deep. This is a time for us to unshackle all of the resources that we have and put them to productive endeavor. This is a time for us to build intra-regional trade and form partnerships with other groupings and countries. This is a time for us to consolidate the regional stock exchange, to consolidate the whole issue of the industrial policy regime, which, though framed within the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas in 1992, when we instituted the trade regime remains unfinished, and that is the reason why our industrial sector hasn't grown. We need to engage those opportunities now and not wait for another crisis to do so. In the midst of all this, CARICOM live in an era and among countries where there are immense opportunities for prosperity still.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. Colin?
Thank you, Colin, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. From my end, I'd like to close by saying to private sector businesses, the Chamber is here as a partner, and the Chamber has been working tirelessly for long hours, as a matter of fact, sometimes on weekends even, to ensure that we put our best case forward to mitigate any sort of impact to Grenadian businesses. And I want to encourage small businesses who may be concerned, and we know there's a lot of concern, to start thinking how you're going to weather this storm. How are you going to be more innovative? Are there ways you could drive down costs within your business? Are you going to start looking at new horizons for trade and not rely on traditional horizons? Those are the questions we need to start asking and acting on them. And to persons who believe what's going on in the US, oh, well, you know, that's nothing to do with me, it's not going to affect me, this is US thing and US politics, and I say they're going to be in for a rude awakening. Let's have a discussion. Those with ideas, come forward. Let's remove politics from this, and those with ideas, come forward, and let's see how we could all come and be resilient and weather the storm together. That's what it's going to take.
Mr. Colin Francis, Mr. Kunta Kunte Andal, and Dr. Patrick Antoine, thank you all for this enlightening conversation. To you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. But a couple of messages as takeaways. It's important that we support our own here being defined as Grenadian, yes, OECS, yes, CARICOM, definitely. And as we shop Grenada, we shop OECS, we shop CARICOM. Let us strengthen each other. And I will leave you with this thought. The 4th of July is CARICOM Day. Let that be our mentality. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I look forward to being with you on another episode of Beyond the Headlines. Take good care. Godspeed.